London, 1827. The Georgian era reached its twilight as King George IV ruled over an empire where social hierarchy determined every breath, every glance, every whispered word in the marble corridors of power. The aristocracy moved through their gilded world like chess pieces on an elaborate board, where one wrong move could mean social annihilation, exile, or worse. The city itself had transformed into a monument to British supremacy, its streets paved with the wealth of colonies stretching from India to the Caribbean. The Thames ran thick with commerce as ships bearing exotic goods from distant shores filled London's coffers with unprecedented prosperity. This wealth manifested itself in the extraordinary opulence of aristocratic life, where a single evening gown might cost more than a working family's annual income, and where the maintenance of a London townhouse required staff numbering in the dozens. The architectural grandeur of Mayfair and Belgravia reflected this golden age of British power. Terraced houses designed by master architects like John Nash stood in perfect symmetry, their cream-colored facades rising like monuments to refined taste and unlimited resources. Behind these elegant exteriors lay interiors of breathtaking luxury, drawing rooms appointed with furniture crafted by Chippendale, dining rooms graced with Waterford crystal and Sèvres porcelain, and libraries housing leather-bound volumes that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge and culture. In the heart of Mayfair, gas lamps flickered against the November fog, casting dancing shadows across the cobblestones where elegant carriages rolled past mansions that housed centuries of noble bloodlines. These Georgian palaces, with their perfectly symmetrical facades and imposing columns, stood as monuments to a society built on tradition, protocol, and the unforgiving weight of reputation. The rhythms of aristocratic life followed patterns established over generations. Mornings began with chocolate served in delicate porcelain cups while ladies received their personal maids who arranged elaborate toilettes that could take hours to complete. The ritual of dressing was an art form in itself, corsets laced with mathematical precision, chemises of finest cambric, stockings of silk so delicate they tore at the slightest rough handling. Hair was arranged in intricate styles that required the services of skilled French coiffeurs, adorned with ribbons, pearls, and tortoise-shell combs that had been passed down through noble families for centuries. Gentlemen's morning routines were equally elaborate, though conducted with masculine restraint. Valets laid out fresh linen, polished boots to mirror-like perfection, and arranged cravats with the precision of military engineers. The art of tying a cravat had spawned entire treatises on proper technique, with styles bearing names like mathematical, oriental, and Napoleon that indicated both fashion consciousness and political allegiance. A gentleman's appearance spoke volumes about his breeding, his wealth, and his attention to the social codes that governed every aspect of civilized life. The Queen Consort, Her Majesty Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, held court with an iron fist wrapped in silk gloves. Though not born to the English throne, she had mastered the intricate dance of royal protocol with ruthless precision. Her drawing rooms in Windsor Castle were theatres of power where careers were made and destroyed with a single raised eyebrow or withheld invitation. The Queen's favour was currency more valuable than gold, and her displeasure was a death sentence to one's place in society. Her Majesty's daily schedule was a masterpiece of calculated public performance. Each morning began with private prayers in the Queen's Chapel, followed by audiences with selected members of the nobility who had been granted the extraordinary privilege of royal attention. These meetings, conducted in rooms furnished with priceless tapestries and furniture that had belonged to monarchs for generations, were exercises in diplomatic theatre where every word carried weight and every gesture was scrutinized for hidden meaning. The Queen's ladies-in-waiting formed an inner circle of extraordinary influence, chosen not merely for their beauty or bloodlines but for their intelligence and absolute loyalty to the Crown. Lady Pemberton, the Queen's closest confidant, possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of aristocratic genealogy and personal secrets that made her invaluable in managing the complex web of court politics. The Duchess of Marlborough served as unofficial arbiter of fashion, her approval or disapproval of a particular style capable of influencing the wardrobes of hundreds of noble ladies. Lady Fitzroy managed correspondence and scheduling with the efficiency of a military commander, ensuring that royal favor was distributed with strategic precision. The royal household itself employed hundreds of servants in roles ranging from the sublime to the mundane. Master cooks trained in the finest European traditions created elaborate meals that were works of art as much as sustenance. Footmen in royal livery moved through palace corridors with choreographed precision, their powdered wigs and silk stockings symbols of the theatrical nature of royal life. Even the Queen's personal seamstresses held positions of extraordinary responsibility, as Her Majesty's appearance at public events was carefully calculated to convey specific messages about royal power and British superiority. The aristocratic world operated under codes as rigid as natural law. Ladies wore empire-waisted gowns of silk and muslin, their décolletage modest but alluring, while gentlemen appeared in perfectly tailored dark coats with high collars and intricate cravats. Every accessory told a story, from the family diamonds adorning a duchess's throat to the signet rings that marked a lord's ancient lineage. Gloves were never removed in public, calling cards were presented with ceremonial precision, and the art of conversation required years of training to master its subtle implications. Marriage among the nobility was rarely about love and always about alliance. Fortunes were merged, bloodlines preserved, and political power consolidated through carefully orchestrated unions blessed in grand cathedral ceremonies. Young ladies were groomed from birth to attract suitable matches, their education focused on accomplishments that would enhance their value in the marriage market, speaking French, playing the pianoforte with delicate precision, painting watercolors of pastoral scenes, and managing household staffs with gentle authority. The social calendar revolved around a series of elaborate rituals. The London season brought together the cream of society for months of balls, opera performances, garden parties, and intimate dinners where reputations were made and unmade. Ladies received callers in their drawing rooms during prescribed hours, while gentlemen conducted business in their clubs, smoking rooms thick with tobacco and whispered deals. The theater provided a stage for public display, where the audience was as much a spectacle as the performers. Yet beneath this polished surface lurked dangers as deadly as any battlefield. Scandal could destroy generations of carefully built reputation. Whispered rumors traveled faster than wildfire through drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs. Social exile was a fate worse than death, condemning the unfortunate to a twilight existence on the margins of civilized society. Those who fell from grace found themselves cut from invitation lists, their presence unwelcome in the very spaces where they once held sway. Into this world of rigid propriety and unforgiving judgment, stories emerged of those who dared to challenge the established order. Tales of passionate love affairs that defied family expectations, of political intrigues that toppled dynasties, of secret vendettas that simmered for years before erupting in spectacular revenge. These stories whispered through ballrooms and boudoirs, reminding everyone that beneath the veneer of civilization lay the raw human emotions that no amount of etiquette could fully contain. The protocol governing royal interactions was particularly sacred. To be presented at court required months of preparation, from learning the intricate curtsy that demonstrated proper submission to mastering the backward exit that showed one never turned their back on royalty. Court dress was prescribed down to the smallest detail, white gowns with trains of specific lengths, feathers in the hair arranged just so, and family jewels displayed to indicate one's place in the hierarchy. Those who transgressed against royal protocol faced immediate banishment from court society. The Queen's memory was long and her forgiveness rare. She maintained detailed records of social infractions, real and imagined slights, and political oppositions. Her ladies-in-waiting served as her eyes and ears, reporting every whispered confidence, every suspicious glance, every hint of disloyalty. The court was a spider's web with the Queen at its center, sensing every vibration that might indicate threat or opportunity. 12 years had passed since Lady Evangeline Ashworth last set foot on English soil. Now, as her modest traveling carriage rumbled through the gates of London, she gazed upon a city transformed yet familiar. The same grand mansions lined the streets, but new gaslight-illuminated thoroughfares where oil lamps once flickered. The same rigid social hierarchies governed society, but political winds had shifted, creating new alliances and fresh opportunities for those clever enough to seize them. Evangeline was no longer the naive girl of 17 who had been publicly humiliated and banished from court. 12 years of exile in the remote Scottish Highlands had forged her into something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Her beauty had matured from pretty youth into striking elegance, her emerald eyes now holding depths that spoke of suffering survived and lessons learned in solitude. The modest inn where she took lodgings belied her true purpose. To the world, she was simply Mrs. Catherine Winters, a widow of moderate means seeking to establish herself in London society. Her references were impeccable, her manners refined, her story plausible but unremarkable. She had spent years crafting this identity, learning to move through society invisibly while gathering the information and resources necessary for her ultimate goal. Her first weeks in London were spent in careful reconnaissance. She attended small gatherings, observing how the social landscape had evolved during her absence. New faces had emerged in positions of influence, while others she remembered from her youth had aged into positions of greater power. She noted which marriages had taken place, which alliances had formed, which scandals had erupted and been forgotten. Every detail was catalogued in her sharp memory, pieces of a puzzle she was methodically assembling. At Lady Pemberton's Tuesday salon, she encountered familiar faces who failed to recognize the transformed exile. Her former friend Charlotte, now the Duchess of Marlborough, chatted pleasantly about literature and music without the slightest suspicion. Lord Fitzhugh, who had once paid court to young Evangeline, now showed polite interest in the mysterious widow's opinions on politics and art. The irony was exquisite, she moved freely among those who had witnessed her downfall, invisible in plain sight. The Queen still held her iron grip on London society, though age had added steel to her already formidable presence. At 63, Her Majesty commanded respect through a combination of royal authority and personal magnetism that few dared challenge. Her weekly drawing rooms remained the pinnacle of social achievement, her approval still the ultimate validation of one's place in the hierarchy. She had grown more selective with her favor, more ruthless in her judgments, more unforgiving of perceived slights. During a chance encounter at Hatchett's bookstore, Evangeline first saw her former destroyer since the night of her exile. The Queen, accompanied by her ladies-in-waiting and a discreet security detail, moved through the shop like a force of nature. Customers melted away in deference, shopkeepers bowed with nervous precision, and even the air seemed to still in her presence. Evangeline felt her pulse quicken as she observed the woman who had stolen her life with casual cruelty. But it was another figure who truly captured her attention. Lord Sebastian Ravenscroft, heir to the Duke of Ashford, possessed the kind of dark magnetism that drew every female eye in any room he entered. Tall and lean with aristocratic features carved by an artist's hand, his reputation preceded him as both a dangerous rake and a brilliant political mind. His dark hair caught the light like polished obsidian, while his steel-gray eyes seemed to see through every pretense and social mask. Sebastian had been abroad during her original disgrace, serving in diplomatic posts that had only enhanced his already formidable reputation. Now returned to London, he moved through society with the confidence of a man who knew his own worth and cared little for others' opinions. Women vied for his attention while men sought his political alliance, yet he remained somewhat aloof from the desperate marriage mart that dominated aristocratic society. Their first conversation occurred at Lord Whitmore's evening soirée, where Evangeline had carefully positioned herself near the French doors leading to the garden. Sebastian approached with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, his eyes holding an intelligence that immediately put her on guard. "Mrs. Winters, I believe. I confess myself intrigued by London's newest mystery. You appear from nowhere with impeccable credentials, yet no one seems to recall meeting you before." His voice carried the cultured tones of Eton and Oxford, but underneath lay something more dangerous. "My lord, I fear my life has been quite unremarkable. A quiet marriage, a peaceful widowhood, and now a modest return to society. Hardly the stuff of mystery." Evangeline's reply was perfectly calculated, demure enough to maintain her cover, yet confident enough to hold his interest. Their verbal sparring continued through several encounters, each testing the other's defenses while maintaining the elaborate courtesies that governed aristocratic interaction. Sebastian was clearly suspicious of her sudden appearance, yet drawn by an attraction he seemed reluctant to acknowledge. For Evangeline, he represented both opportunity and danger, a potential ally whose political connections could prove invaluable, yet whose perceptive nature threatened her carefully constructed facade. The social calendar that autumn was particularly full, providing numerous opportunities for their paths to cross. At Lady Thornbury's musical evening, Sebastian observed Evangeline's reaction to a performer singing Italian arias, a skill she had perfected during her youth but now had to pretend to appreciate as a novice. At the Duke of Richmond's dinner party, he noted her familiarity with court protocol despite her supposed distance from royal circles. As autumn deepened into winter, the dangerous game between Evangeline and Sebastian intensified. Their attraction grew despite, or perhaps because of, the layers of deception that surrounded their every interaction. Society began to whisper about the mysterious widow who had captured the attention of London's most eligible bachelor, unaware that beneath the romantic speculation lay currents far more treacherous. Sebastian's pursuit became more determined as his suspicions deepened. He began investigating Mrs. Catherine Winters with the thoroughness of a man accustomed to unraveling diplomatic mysteries. Her references checked out, her financial background appeared solid, yet something indefinable troubled him. Perhaps it was the way her eyes occasionally flickered with recognition at names she should not know, or how her hands moved with aristocratic grace despite her claims of modest origins. Their courtship, if it could be called that, played out in the public spaces where London society gathered. At Almack's assembly rooms, they danced the intricate steps of the country dance while engaging in verbal dueling that left both exhilarated and frustrated. The physical attraction between them was undeniable, electricity seemed to spark when their gloved hands touched, when he guided her through the figures of the dance, when their eyes met across crowded drawing rooms. "You dance as if you learned in a palace, Mrs. Winters, yet you claim provincial origins," Sebastian murmured during a particularly intimate moment of the waltz. The new dance had caused scandal when first introduced, its close hold and swirling movements deemed almost indecent by conservative elements of society. "Perhaps I had an exceptional dancing master, my lord. Or perhaps you credit me with more sophistication than I possess." Her reply was breathless, though whether from the exertion of the dance or his proximity was unclear. The winter season brought a succession of lavish entertainments as the aristocracy sought to banish the gloom of December with blazing chandeliers and elaborate festivities. At the Countess of Devonshire's Christmas ball, Evangeline wore a gown of deep burgundy silk that complemented her dark hair and pale skin. The dress, while fashionable, was notably less extravagant than those worn by the married ladies of highest rank, a careful balance between attracting attention and maintaining her role as a modest widow. Sebastian appeared that evening in perfectly tailored black evening dress, his cravat arranged with mathematical precision, his dark hair gleaming in the candlelight. When he claimed her for the supper dance, society noted with satisfaction that the season's most intriguing romantic speculation was reaching its climax. But beneath the romantic surface, Evangeline was methodically implementing her plan for revenge. She had identified key weaknesses in the Queen's inner circle through careful observation and strategic friendships. Lady Pemberton, the Queen's closest confidant, harbored a secret gambling addiction that left her vulnerable to financial pressure. Lord Fitzroy, master of the Queen's household, was conducting a discreet affair with a married woman whose husband possessed devastating political information. The information gathering required skills Evangeline had developed during her years of exile. Living in isolation had taught her patience, while necessity had honed her ability to observe human nature with ruthless accuracy. She cultivated friendships with servants, charmed confidences from lonely dowagers, and attended social gatherings where wine loosened tongues and revealed secrets. Her modest lodging served as a base for operations that would have impressed any intelligence service. She maintained detailed notes on every significant figure in London society, mapping relationships, documenting scandals, and tracking the flow of political influence. Her correspondence, conducted under various assumed names, reached contacts throughout England and the continent who provided additional intelligence. The first phase of her revenge involved undermining the Queen's social authority through a series of carefully orchestrated embarrassments. Anonymous letters began circulating among the ton, revealing various indiscretions and hypocrisies within the royal circle. A scandalous pamphlet appeared questioning the Queen's interference in matters beyond her constitutional authority. Society began to whisper that perhaps Her Majesty was not as all-knowing and all-powerful as she appeared. Sebastian's investigation into Mrs. Winters intensified as these mysterious disruptions began affecting the stability of the social order he was part of. His political instincts told him that the timing of her arrival and the emergence of organized opposition to the Queen's authority was too convenient to be coincidental. Yet his growing feelings for her complicated his judgment in ways that both thrilled and disturbed him. Their most intimate conversation occurred during a winter evening at the opera, where Sebastian had secured a private box that allowed for discreet conversation during the performance. The music provided cover for words that could not be spoken in more public venues. "I find myself in an unusual position, Mrs. Winters. My mind tells me you are not what you seem, yet my heart refuses to listen to logic." Sebastian's admission was made while gazing at the stage, his profile revealing the internal struggle between duty and desire. "And what does your heart tell you, my lord?" Evangeline's question was barely audible above the soprano's aria, yet it seemed to echo in the intimate space between them. "That you are the most fascinating woman I have ever encountered. That beneath your carefully maintained facade lies a story of such complexity that I would spend years unraveling it. That despite every rational concern, I am falling in love with a mystery." His confession hung in the air between them like a challenge. The physical tension between them reached a crescendo when Sebastian escorted her home through the fog-shrouded streets of Mayfair. Their carriage ride passed in electric silence, both acutely aware of the attraction that threatened to overwhelm their carefully maintained defenses. When he handed her down at her lodgings, their gloved fingers lingered longer than propriety demanded. "Sebastian," she whispered, using his given name for the first time, "if you knew the truth about me, would you still speak of love?" "Try me," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. But Evangeline stepped back, her moment of weakness passing as quickly as it had come. "Some truths are too dangerous for love to survive," she said before disappearing into the shadows of her doorway. The new year of 1828 arrived with London society electric with anticipation for the Queen's Grand Winter Ball, the most exclusive event of the social calendar. Held annually at St. James's Palace, the ball served as both celebration and demonstration of royal power. Only the highest-ranking members of the aristocracy received the coveted invitations, delivered on cream vellum paper bearing the royal seal. For Evangeline, this ball represented the culmination of months of careful planning. Her network of carefully cultivated informants had provided her with intelligence that would destroy the Queen's reputation and expose the corruption at the heart of the royal circle. More importantly, she had discovered the one secret that would allow her to reclaim her true identity and exact the revenge she had dreamed of for 12 long years. Sebastian's suspicions had crystallized into near certainty that Mrs. Catherine Winters was not who she claimed to be. His diplomatic contacts had revealed discrepancies in her background that no amount of careful planning could completely erase. The death records for the supposedly deceased Mr. Winters contained irregularities, and financial transactions suggested resources far beyond what a modest widow should possess. The night of the Queen's ball, Evangeline prepared herself with the solemnity of a warrior donning armor for battle. She had commissioned a gown specifically for this occasion, silk the color of midnight sky, cut in the latest fashion but reminiscent of the style she had worn during her original presentation at court. Her mother's diamonds, hidden away during her exile and now reset in a more contemporary style, adorned her throat and ears. As she studied her reflection in the modest mirror of her lodgings, Evangeline saw both the girl she had been and the woman she had become. The frightened 17-year-old who had fled London in disgrace was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that survival required strength and that justice sometimes demanded ruthless action. Sebastian arrived to escort her to the ball in his family's finest carriage, pulled by matched bays and attended by liveried footmen. His evening dress was impeccable as always, but she noticed the tension in his jaw, the alertness in his eyes that suggested he was prepared for whatever revelation the evening might bring. "You look magnificent," he said as he handed her into the carriage, his voice carefully neutral despite the admiration in his eyes. "I feel as though I am preparing for battle," she replied with uncharacteristic honesty. "Perhaps you are," he said quietly, studying her profile in the lamplight. "The question is whether you are my ally or my enemy." St. James's Palace blazed with the light of 1,000 candles as London's elite gathered for the Queen's grand entertainment. The receiving line moved with ceremonial precision as guests were announced and presented to their majesties. The ballroom, decorated with hothouse flowers and gold leaf that caught the light like captured stars, provided a setting of almost overwhelming magnificence. Evangeline's presentation as Mrs. Catherine Winters proceeded without incident, the Queen's brief nod indicating royal acknowledgement without particular interest. But as she curtsied and withdrew according to protocol, their eyes met for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Something flickered in the Queen's expression, not recognition, but perhaps an instinctive sense of significance that she could not yet identify. The dancing began with the traditional country dances that allowed for conversation and observation. Sebastian claimed Evangeline for the opening set, their familiarity as partners now evident to all observers. Society watched with interest as the season's most speculated upon couple moved through the intricate figures with practiced ease. "Tonight feels different," Sebastian murmured as they came together in the dance. "As if everything we have built between us hangs in the balance." "Perhaps it does," she replied, her eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made his breath catch. As the evening progressed, Evangeline began implementing the final phase of her plan. Anonymous servants, carefully positioned throughout the palace, began distributing copies of documents that exposed the Queen's illegal interference in parliamentary proceedings. Letters revealing personal corruption among the royal household started appearing in strategic locations where influential guests would discover them. The first signs of disturbance appeared as whispered conversations grew more urgent and clusters of noble guests examined the mysterious documents with growing alarm. The Queen's ladies-in-waiting began reporting disturbing discoveries to their mistress, who maintained her composure with iron discipline even as her world began crumbling around her. Sebastian recognized the orchestrated nature of the evening's disruptions with the trained eye of a diplomat. As he observed the careful timing and strategic placement of each revelation, his suspicions about Mrs. Winters crystallized into certainty. Only someone with intimate knowledge of court protocol and access to highly classified information could have planned such an operation. The climactic moment arrived during the evening's most formal entertainment, a performance by the finest musicians of the Royal Opera. As the soprano reached the aria's emotional peak, Evangeline rose from her seat and began walking toward the front of the assembly. The movement was so unexpected, so contrary to protocol, that conversation stopped and all eyes turned to follow her progress. "Your Majesty," she said in a voice that carried clearly through the stunned silence, "I believe it is time we acknowledged each other properly." The Queen's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, recognition, and finally a mixture of rage and fear that she quickly concealed behind royal dignity. "I'm afraid I don't understand your meaning," she replied, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "Then perhaps this will refresh your memory," Evangeline said, producing a letter bearing the royal seal. "The order for my exile, signed by your own hand 12 years ago. The destruction of Lady Evangeline Ashworth based on fabricated evidence and perjured testimony." The assembly erupted in shocked whispers as the implications became clear. The mysterious Mrs. Winters was revealed as the disgraced Lady Evangeline, returned from exile to confront the Queen who had destroyed her life. Sebastian felt the world shift beneath his feet as he realized the woman he loved had been playing a role far more complex than he had imagined. "You were banished for treasonous activities," the Queen said, struggling to maintain control of the situation. "Your return violates the terms of your exile." "My return is protected by new evidence that proves my innocence and exposes your guilt," Evangeline replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Evidence that will be presented to Parliament tomorrow, along with documentation of your illegal activities over the past 12 years. The ballroom fell into absolute silence as the full scope of the confrontation became apparent. This was not merely a personal dispute but a challenge to the very foundations of royal authority. Sebastian found himself caught between his loyalty to the crown and his growing understanding that the woman he loved might be fighting for justice rather than mere revenge. The Queen's grand winter ball disintegrated into chaos as the implications of Evangeline's revelations rippled through London's elite society. Guests departed in hurried whispers, carriages streaming away from St. James's Palace like escaping birds. By dawn, every drawing room in Mayfair buzzed with speculation about the returned exile and her explosive accusations against the crown. Sebastian spent the remainder of that night pacing his study, wrestling with the complete upheaval of everything he thought he knew. The woman he had fallen in love with was not Mrs. Catherine Winters, modest widow, but Lady Evangeline Ashworth, a name that carried the weight of one of society's most notorious scandals. More troubling still was the growing evidence that her original disgrace might have been orchestrated by the very institution he had sworn to serve. At his Grosvenor Square mansion, Sebastian summoned his most trusted valet and longtime confidant, Matthews, who had served the Ravenscroft family for over 30 years. If anyone would remember the details of a 12-year-old scandal, it would be Matthews, whose memory for society gossip was legendary among the servant class. "The Ashworth affair," Matthews said slowly, his weathered face thoughtful. My lord, I remember it well. A terrible business, that was. The young lady was accused of passing state secrets to French agents, but there were those who thought the evidence too convenient, the witnesses too eager to condemn. What was your impression at the time? Sebastian asked, pouring himself a brandy despite the early hour. That someone wanted her gone, my lord. The lady had caught the attention of too many important gentlemen, had too much influence for one so young. There were whispers that she had crossed the Queen in some personal matter, though none could say what. Meanwhile, Evangeline had returned to her modest lodgings to find them under discreet surveillance. Royal guards in civilian dress watched from doorways and street corners, while agents of the Crown's intelligence service had clearly searched her rooms with professional thoroughness. She had expected this response and was prepared for it. The evidence she possessed was safely hidden in multiple locations throughout London, copies secured with trusted allies who would ensure its publication regardless of what happened to her personally. 12 years of planning had taught her to anticipate every possible countermove the Crown might make. Her morning visitors began arriving before 10 o'clock. First came Lady Pemberton, the Queen's former confidant, whose pallor and shaking hands revealed the extent of her distress. The gambling debts that Evangeline had discovered made the older woman vulnerable to pressure from multiple directions. "My dear," Lady Pemberton said without preamble, "you must reconsider this course of action. The Queen is prepared to be generous, a full pardon, restoration of your titles, even a substantial settlement if you withdraw these accusations. And what of justice for the 12 years stolen from my life?" Evangeline replied, pouring tea with steady hands. "What of the truth about the corruption and abuse of power that continues to this day? Truth is a luxury that people in our position cannot always afford," Lady Pemberton said desperately. "You have made your point, demonstrated your power. Now be wise enough to accept victory and step back from the precipice." But Evangeline had moved beyond the possibility of compromise. The girl who had fled London in disgrace might have accepted such an offer, but the woman forged in exile would settle for nothing less than complete vindication and accountability. Her afternoon caller was Lord Fitzroy, master of the Queen's household, whose affair Evangeline had documented with devastating thoroughness. His approach was more direct than Lady Pemberton's pleading. "You have created a dangerous situation," he said without preamble. "Forces are in motion that you may not be able to control. The Crown has resources at its disposal that go far beyond social ostracism." "Are you threatening me, my lord?" Evangeline asked with dangerous calm. "I am warning you that some secrets are protected by more than social convention. Your exile was merciful compared to what could happen to someone who threatens the stability of the realm." That evening, Sebastian arrived at her lodgings with the determination of a man who had made a difficult decision. His formal evening dress and grim expression suggested this was not a social call but something far more serious. "We need to talk," he said simply, and she admitted him to her modest sitting room. "I suppose you know everything now," she said, not bothering with the pretense that had governed their previous interactions. "I know enough," he replied, studying her face in the lamplight. "The question is whether what I've learned changes how I feel about you." Their conversation stretched deep into the night as Evangeline finally told her complete story. She revealed the details of her original disgrace, how she had discovered evidence of the Queen's illegal activities and naively attempted to expose them through proper channels. Her reward had been false accusations, manufactured evidence, and immediate exile to prevent her from defending herself. "I was 17, she said quietly, her voice filled with the pain of remembered betrayal. "I believed that truth would protect me, that justice would prevail if I simply followed the proper procedures. I learned otherwise when they dragged me from my bed in the middle of the night and put me on a ship to Scotland with nothing but the clothes on my back." Sebastian listened without interruption as she described the 12 years that followed, the grinding poverty, the social isolation, the systematic destruction of every connection to her former life. She explained how she had slowly built a new identity while gathering evidence and planning her return. "The woman you fell in love with was not entirely false," she said finally. "Mrs. Catherine Winters was who I became during my exile, someone who understood that survival required strength and that justice sometimes demanded patience." "And now?" Sebastian asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Now I finish what I started. The evidence goes to Parliament tomorrow, regardless of the consequences." Their physical attraction, suppressed for months beneath layers of deception and social propriety, finally overwhelmed their restraint. When Sebastian pulled her into his arms, 12 years of loneliness and weeks of careful self-control dissolved in a moment of passionate abandon that left them both breathless and irrevocably changed. But even as they clung to each other in the lamplight, both understood that their love might not survive the storm that was about to break over London society. The dawn of January 15, 1828, broke grey and cold over London as the most significant political crisis in decades reached its climax. In the Houses of Parliament, members gathered for an emergency session called to examine evidence that threatened to topple the very foundations of royal authority. The galleries filled with peers and influential citizens who understood they were witnessing history in the making. Evangeline arrived at Westminster in Sebastian's carriage, their united front a declaration that transcended political considerations. She wore her finest day dress, deep blue wool with jet buttons, her mother's pearl necklace providing the only adornment. Her bearing was that of a woman who had fought her way back from social death and was prepared to see justice done regardless of personal cost. The evidence she presented was devastating in its thoroughness and undeniable in its authenticity. Letters in the Queen's own hand revealed systematic interference in parliamentary proceedings, bribery of witnesses in criminal proceedings, and abuse of royal prerogatives for personal vendettas. The documentation of her own case became merely one example in a pattern of constitutional violations that shocked even the most cynical political observers. Lord Whitmore, as chairman of the investigating committee, conducted the proceedings with the gravity befitting such momentous accusations. His questions were precise and thorough, giving Evangeline the opportunity to present 12 years of meticulously gathered evidence without interruption or harassment. "Lady Ashworth," he said formally, using her restored title with deliberate emphasis, "these are extraordinary allegations against the Crown. Are you prepared to swear to their truth under oath and penalty of perjury?" "I am, my lord," she replied without hesitation. "And I am prepared to provide additional witnesses and documentation to support every claim." The Queen's representatives attempted a vigorous defense, but the weight of evidence proved overwhelming. Letters, financial records, witness statements, and official documents painted a picture of systematic corruption that even the most loyal supporters could not explain away. The constitutional monarchy that governed England required the Crown to operate within legal boundaries that had been flagrantly violated. During a brief recess, Sebastian found Evangeline in the corridor outside the committee room. Her composure remained perfect, but he could see the toll that years of preparation and the morning's testimony had taken. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly, "you have achieved something remarkable. You have forced the most powerful woman in England to account for her actions." "Justice was all I ever wanted," she replied, leaning against the stone wall for support. "Not revenge, despite what everyone believes. Simply justice and the restoration of my name." "You have both," he assured her, taking her hand in his despite the impropriety of such public affection. "The question now is what comes after justice." The afternoon session brought the Queen herself to Parliament, accompanied by her legal representatives and a phalanx of royal guards. Her entrance created a sensation as members rose in acknowledgement of her presence. She appeared regal and composed, but those who knew her well noted the steel in her spine and the careful control of her expression. The confrontation between the Queen and her accuser took place in the most formal setting imaginable, with the full weight of constitutional law and parliamentary procedure governing every word. Yet beneath the ceremonial language lay currents of personal animosity and long-suppressed truth that gave the proceedings an almost mythic quality. "Your Majesty," Lord Whitmore began carefully, "Lady Ashworth has presented serious allegations regarding your conduct over the past 12 years. Do you wish to respond to these charges?" The Queen's response was a masterpiece of royal dignity under pressure. She acknowledged certain irregularities in her administration while maintaining that her actions had been motivated by genuine concern for national security. She expressed regret for any misunderstandings that might have occurred while stopping short of admitting criminal conduct. But when directly confronted with evidence of her role in Evangeline's destruction, her composure finally cracked slightly. "The lady in question was engaged in treasonous correspondence," she said with cold precision. "My actions prevented greater harm to the realm. Yet the evidence shows that this correspondence was fabricated," Evangeline replied with quiet steel. "The letters bearing my signature were clever forgeries, the witnesses were paid perjurers, and the entire case was constructed to remove someone who had become inconvenient to your Majesty's plans." The final revelation came when Evangeline produced the Queen's private correspondence with her agents, detailing the plan to destroy an innocent young woman whose only crime had been witnessing royal misconduct. The letters revealed not just corruption but personal malice that shocked even the most worldly observers. As the evidence mounted and its implications became undeniable, a curious transformation occurred in the parliamentary chamber. What had begun as a formal inquiry into specific allegations evolved into something larger, a recognition that the constitutional balance between royal prerogative and legal accountability had been fundamentally altered. The Queen's capitulation, when it came, was as dignified as circumstances allowed. Faced with evidence that could not be refuted and political consequences that could not be avoided, she agreed to a resolution that included full restoration of Evangeline's titles and properties, substantial financial compensation, and constitutional reforms that would prevent similar abuses in the future. "I accept that mistakes were made," the Queen said in her final statement to Parliament. "I hope that Lady Ashworth can find it in her heart to forgive the injuries that have been done to her." Evangeline's response was measured but firm. "Your Majesty, forgiveness is a personal matter between individuals. Justice is a public matter that serves the entire realm. Today, justice has been served." The resolution of the political crisis opened the door for personal resolutions that had been impossible while the constitutional battle raged. Sebastian's proposal came that evening in the garden of her restored Mayfair mansion, on the same terrace where she had once planned her debut into society as an innocent 17-year-old. "I fell in love with Mrs. Catherine Winters," he said, kneeling among the winter roses. "But I want to marry Lady Evangeline Ashworth, all of her, including the parts forged in exile and tempered by injustice." Their wedding 6 months later was the social event of the 1828 season, attended by the same society that had once witnessed her disgrace. The ceremony at St. George's, Hanover Square, symbolized not just the union of two hearts but the complete restoration of a reputation that many had thought permanently destroyed. As Lady Evangeline Ravenscroft, she used her position and resources to establish legal reforms that protected others from the abuses she had suffered. Her foundation provided support for those wrongly accused of crimes, while her political influence helped pass legislation strengthening constitutional protections against royal overreach. The Queen, chastened by her defeat but not broken, adapted to the new constitutional reality with characteristic resilience. Their relationship remained formal and correct, based on mutual respect rather than warmth, but the personal vendetta that had driven their conflict was finally laid to rest. Sebastian's diplomatic career flourished under the new political dispensation, his reputation enhanced rather than damaged by his association with the woman who had challenged royal authority and won. Their marriage became a partnership in both personal happiness and public service that served as a model for their generation. Years later, As she watched her own daughter prepare for presentation at court under very different circumstances, Evangeline reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from disgrace to triumph. The frightened girl who had fled London in the middle of the night had become a woman whose name was synonymous with courage and perseverance. "Mama," her daughter asked, "do you ever regret the years you spent in exile?" "No, darling," Evangeline replied, watching the sunset paint the London sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Those years taught me that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that sometimes the longest path to happiness is also the surest." The story that had begun with exile and revenge had ended with love and renewal, proving that even in the rigid hierarchies of aristocratic society, truth and persistence could triumph over corruption and abuse of power. Lady Evangeline Ashworth had waited 12 years for her revenge against the Queen, but in the end, she had achieved something far more valuable: justice, love, and the knowledge that no one, regardless of their position, was above the law. In the drawing rooms and ballrooms of London society, her story became legend, a reminder that beneath the polished surface of aristocratic life lay the same human emotions and moral choices that governed all lives. She had proven that exile could not break a determined spirit, that injustice could not permanently silence truth, and that love could flourish even in the midst of political upheaval. The Queen eventually acknowledged, in private moments of reflection, that she had underestimated the 17-year-old girl whose destruction she had so casually ordered. The woman who returned from exile had possessed resources of character and intelligence that no amount of royal power could overcome. In destroying Lady Evangeline Ashworth, the Queen had inadvertently created Lady Evangeline Ravenscroft, a far more formidable opponent and, eventually, a more effective force for justice. And so the tale that had begun in the shadows of disgrace and exile concluded in the bright light of vindication and love, proving that sometimes the most satisfying revenge is simply living well and ensuring that justice, however delayed, finally prevails.